So this lecture, or this series of lectures, is going to be about the cell. And here are some fantastic colorized micrographs of some cool looking cells. So let's jump into it. So cells are the working units of life. As you should probably already know from like the first section, cells are the smallest unit that can be called life. And cells are incredibly complex, and they also specialize, which we're going to talk about here in a second. We're also going to be reviewing the metric system, which we talked a little bit about in lab. And you also should remember that anything that is alive is composed of a cell. And you should also know that every cell came from another cell. All right. And there's some discussion about that, about whether or not viruses are alive, which is a discussion maybe we can have in class or in lab next week. But we'll figure that out. I don't think viruses are alive, by the way. That's just my opinion. But they definitely use cells' machinery in order to reproduce. All cells contain cytoplasm. They have a plasma membrane, and they have genetic material. Okay. And maybe you've seen in the book the term cytosol, and we're going to talk about cytosol versus cytoplasm later on. There are two main types of cells, and they mostly differ in where the DNA is kept. Okay, and they also differ in that one of them contains organelles and one of them does not contain organelles, and we'll talk about that later on. So like I said, cells specialize, like your book talks about for a few moments, that there's like muffins baking, I think is the example they used. And you have to have enough of those muffin particles sort of accumulate inside your nose, land on these cilia of this nasal nerve cell, which is then going to conduct signals back to your brain. The point of this being that this is a very, very specific, a very, very specialized cell type, this nasal nerve cell. So multicellular organisms, we have evolved to allow for this, not to allow for the cell specialization, but we've evolved the cell specialization so that we can do all sorts of different kinds of stuff. Because our cells are specialized in this way, it allows us to have many, many, many different functions. Here's another example of cell specialization. This is a picture of some blood, and as you can see, there's lots of different blood elements. There's lots of different elements going on in your blood. Like these are part of the immune system here. These are transporting oxygen and so on. So this is just another example of how cells are quite specialized. So here's some more micrographs just to kind of give you, these are actual photographs, by the way, but this is just to kind of give you a sense of the size of these bacterial cells. So this is the head of a pen or pencil, maybe, I forget which. And this is magnified 85 times. So that's even a little bit closer than the highest level of magnification that the scope that you're going to be using at your desk can go. Actually, technically, those can go to times 100, but they have to have some special oil immersion thing, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to be doing that. So this is a bit higher than what your microscopes can actually do that we're going to be using in lab. This is magnified 425 times. That's much higher than what yours can do. But in this one, you can start to see, you can start to resolve these tiny little bacterial cells. And then once you get it up to 2,100 times, you can really see what these bacterial cells look like. They're very, 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 very tiny. Okay, so those are prokaryotic bacterial cells. And just to do a quick review of the metric system and to kind of give you a sense of what meters means, because I honestly, I fall back on this pretty often. A meter is almost the same thing as a yard. A meter is a little bit longer than a yard, but they're very close. So if you're thinking about 100 meters, you can go back to the standard American football field is about 100 meters. Okay, it's not an exact measurement, but just to kind of give you a sense, an intuitive sense in your head of what that means. So a centimeter is equal to 0.4 inches. That's actually a little bit less than 0.4 inches. There are 2.54 centimeters in 1 inch. So, a centimeter is 10 to the minus 2 meters, or it is 1/100th of a meter. So in terms of that lab handout that you had, that means that you would move the decimal point 2 spaces to the left, depending on which way you're going. So if you had 100 centimeters, that means you have 1 meter, and you needed to move the decimal point 2 places to the left. If you had 100 meters, how many centimeters would that be? Well, it would be, 100 plus 2 zeros, so you would move it 2 places to the right, and you would wind up with, is that 10,000? I think that's 10,000. And these are really the only ones you need, is the regular unit, centi, milli, micro, and nano. There are some up here that we're going to get to, like maybe kilo is something we might talk about later on. But like the lab handout had a lot of weird ones that like nobody really uses hecto or anything like that. In terms of cells or in terms of small things, you're going to want to know meter, centimeter, millimeter, micrometer, and nanometer. So I'll give you, if I ever asked you to convert between these things like on a test or a quiz, I would just give you these units. It's not super important to need to memorize them, although for your sake, I would probably know that like, the relative size of a centimeter and a millimeter is going to be a pretty good thing to know. You should probably also know that a nanometer is the smallest thing that we're going to be looking at, and it's very, 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 very tiny. 1 nanometer is minuscule, 1 billionth of a meter. And this chart just kind of gives you a sense of scale of some things. So I'll start at the bottom down here. Oops. Start at the bottom down here. So an atom is equal to 0.1 nanometer. Okay, it is less than 1 billionth of a meter. When you get up to lipids, you wind up getting whole numbers. Now you start to get like 1 nanometer. Or proteins tend to be more closer to the size of 10 nanometers. Protein size can vary a great deal, but that's a good estimate. A large virus is about 100 nanometers, okay? And the smallest bacteria is also in that range. They tend to be a little bit larger than that typically, but those are the very, very, very tiny ones. Then you get up to 1 micrometer, which is typically closer to where bacteria are actually going to be living, between 1 and 10 micrometers. And you get to this mitochondria thing, which we're going to talk about later on in this chapter. This is a mitochondria. This is an organelle used to make energy. And then you get up to a eukaryotic cell nucleus. It's maybe 8 nanometers or whatever that unit is there. And then the next level up, sort of above bacteria and some organelles, is the size of the actual cells themselves, between 10 and 100 micrometers. These are eukaryotic cells, which we're going to talk about later. Like I said, bacterial cells are smaller. Okay, bacterial cells are prokaryotic, and prokaryotic cells are going to be smaller than eukaryotic, but that's for a video or two from now. And then kind of getting up to the larger scale, the scale where it's easy to see things with the unaided eye, sort of the millimeter to centimeter range. You have this frog egg here, and then larger than that, you have this chicken egg here. And then, larger than a meter, obviously, you have humans. That should be very familiar to you. And then the largest organism that has ever lived on this planet, or that we have evidence for ever living on this planet, is this blue whale hue, which is enormous. Okay, that's enormous. And then, 100 meters, this is about, a football field would be out here. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense for some cell size things. And sort of on also the tiny, tiny level, this is saying this is 5 nanometers here. So if you had a strand of DNA, it would be, 2.5 nanometers across or thereabouts. It also shows you the size, of a carbon atom, a single atom of carbon, or a single molecule of sugar. Okay. Also shows you the size of a ribosome, and this polio virus looking massive compared to these things, which is actually very, very, very tiny. So the next thing we're going to talk about, and I kind of referenced this in the video you just watched, but we're going to talk about prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells in the next lecture.